Hello, everybody. It's Heather here.
And it's Deb.
Today, we're going to talk about something that's not so sexy. But before we jump into that, I just want to talk about Reluctantly Woo Woo, which is episode number 4, and why Reluctantly Woo Woo. And the reason why Reluctantly Woo Woo is first define woo woo. And woo woo are the things that people find unbelievable and defy the logical mind, but somehow work. And we are having these conversations because we know that there are more people like us that are tired of the conventional route and want to try something different, but are a little bit reluctant to. And even though we're skeptical as practitioners of energy healing modality of the body code, as practitioners, we still have a little skepticism and reluctance in believing it. And instead of being a lot of times people in the energy healing world or alternative stuff world, everybody's like, oh, this is the best. Like, we just want to bring some realness and honesty, honest conversations to it of like, yeah, we don't get it sometimes. All right. So, yeah. So, what are we talking about today, Deb?
We are going to talk about trauma. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is a good topic because everybody has experienced it. We'll talk about what is the big T trauma, what's the little T trauma, and then what causes it. Obviously, how we care for ourselves, how we can take care of that and nurture ourselves and work through it, and then how the body code is going to really kind of help with that healing process. And yeah, Heather's going to be our expert on this one today for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're all experts in trauma because, like you said, we've all experienced trauma. Right?
Absolutely.
So just to get an idea of like what specifically trauma is, and there's a couple different definitions. So if you Google it, the definition will come up and say trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. Right? I love the definitions, though, of Gabor Mate, who is, if you've never heard of Gabor Mate, he is written a ton about trauma. He's an author, a speaker, and he's sought after for his topics about addiction, stress, childhood development. And childhood development is always, we can't talk about childhood development without talking about trauma. And so a couple of different things that he says about trauma is that trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of traumatic events. It's the loss of connection to oneself and to the present moment. So for anybody who's ever experienced trauma, you may have had times where you are going through the motions of things, but you don't feel connected to yourself at all. Okay. And trauma is when we have something really, well, we'll talk about the big T and little T, but we'll have something happen and it causes you, in order to survive it, you have to disconnect from yourself. And we talked about, sorry, I thought my phone was turned off. We talked about how the heart wall, and when we put up that heart wall, it's because we experienced trauma and we put something up to protect ourselves. And that's wise and smart. It's just that when that trauma is over and we're walking around with that guard still, that's what causes us trouble in our life. But another thing that he says about trauma, it's similar, but he says trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you.
I love that quote.
Right?
That's a good one. Yeah.
And
that puts the control. That gives you the control back when you read it that way.
Yeah, exactly. And that is, I want to jump down. One of the things that is being used a lot now in trauma and working with people in trauma is the adverse childhood assessment tool. And it basically looks at different areas. It looks at abuse, physical and sexual. It looks at neglect, physical and emotional, and then family dysfunction, things like family mental illness, physical abuse of the mother, divorce, incarcerated parents, substance abuse in the family. Looks at these different areas and has 10 different questions. And basically it gives probability outcomes of if the answers are, this many, then the probability of being addicted to drugs, being addicted to alcohol, being having a violent future are higher depending on how many are answered. But I think what you said is something really important, is that when we look at trauma, from the lens of not what happens to us, right, but what happens inside of us as a result, that makes a big impact. Because you can have two kids in the same family that have the same like traumas in their family, and one like leads a life of just like total despair, like becomes a drug addict, in and out of jail, and the other one is like a pillar of society. And it's like, why is that? Right? And it's because of what the story that they said about their trauma.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I was talking to my sister-in-law one time, and she said, and she's got a twin sister, and she said they went through it. So they grew up in the same exact household, obviously. And she was like, it was interesting seeing the differences in numbers between her and her sister. She's like, we had the exact same childhood, and how she perceived things and how I perceive things were so completely different. So,
right.
And
I mean, I think that's important, that really trauma on some level is subjective too. Right. I think we can get into that with the big T, little t, what defines that. But there's a lot of nuance in there.
Yes. And that, like, I hope that everybody as they're listening to this realizes that, like, we're just like dipping the toe in the water, scratching the surface. Like, we're not going to go in this deep dive, of trauma, because there's, that can be hours and hours of conversation.
There are people that have entire careers dedicated to that. So
Exactly. So when you mentioned about like big T trauma and little T trauma, so I just put it up on the screen. So big T trauma is most often associated with PTSD, with threats of serious physical injury, death, or sexual violence, and also witnessing these events. Right? So these are things that like anybody in a sound mind would say, yeah, that's a traumatic event. Right. And then little T trauma is when you have highly distressing events that affect an individual or a person, but don't fall into the big T category. So a little T trauma would be when I was younger and went grocery shopping with my mom. I hated going grocery shopping with my mom. And, she'd be in like aisle 5 and she'd be like, go get such and such in a different aisle. And I would go get it. And then I would come back to aisle 5 and she wouldn't be there. And I'd be like, oh my gosh, my mom left me. She abandoned me.
Right.
She didn't. She just went to some other aisle. But in my mind, that was like a big trauma. But it still would be like categorized as a little T, right?
Right. Yeah, I think they can happen on the playground too with your peers, and not that they're always childhood, but I think some of those are they leave a bigger impression when we're little, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And that's because we don't have the emotional skills at that point to be able to say, oh, is this a story that I'm creating? What does this really mean? Is it really true? Like, we don't have those skills, right? And I think part of the experience of being human is coming into this world, and then going into these experiences where we then disconnect from ourselves so that we can have the journey of reconnecting back to ourselves. Seems kind of warped, but like it just seems like that's the way that it is. I don't know anybody who's been in this life who hasn't experienced some kind of trauma and disconnected from themselves, and that beautiful process of getting back connected to yourself. Like, that's just the human experience.
It is. And it's funny, I was just listening to, I don't even know what podcast earlier today, talking about, just a very successful person at this point that's been through a lot of stuff. But I think even when we try not to have our children, like as a parent, trying to protect your child and not have them experience adverse things, and that creates a whole different type of trauma because they don't know how to deal with anything.
Yes. So I met a guy a few years ago. I was at I was in Asheville, and I was staying at this hostel, and I was in a miserable mood that day. I had just gotten my period and I was grumpy and blah, blah, blah. And we started talking, and he was telling me how he owned a treatment facility. And we started talking throughout the night, and I was oblivious because I thought we were just talking about professional stuff. And then later I realized Oh no, like he wanted much more than that. And I'm like, I was miserable. Why did you want that? But one of the things that he said, he was addicted to heroin for 10 years. And he was like, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I had everything
Right.
I could have wanted. And that was traumatic.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, so we have the big T, or like the big things that people would say: abuse, injury, death, sexual violence, witnessing those things. Little T is highly distressing events. And they're like non-life threatening injuries, emotional abuse, death of a pet. I can't imagine. I don't even want to think about how traumatic that could be for me when I lose my Charlie. Like bullying, harassment, or parents saying you're not saying something that's might not even sound like the parent would never remember, right? But like
Right.
you're like, oh my gosh, my parents said this to me, and it became the story for the rest of your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so one of my favorite, I'm going to see if I have this quote up there. Yes. So one of my favorite quotes in all of the work, and why I love the body code, and I think it's so important to do this work, is this quote of, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Right? So when we have these traumatic events and we push them down and don't deal with them, and they're like, why can't I ever connect with anybody? Why does everybody screw me over all the time? Right? And we can look back to childhood, experiences, and it's like, oh, we just keep replaying these roles over and over and over again.
Right.
And what I love about the body code is it helps to bring those things up so that you can release it.
Right.
We'll,
Right.
yeah.
I like these. I mean, I think this to me resonates in the same way the last quote did too, where rather than just leaving it all up to fate, we are providing a way that you can take the reins and not just let your life be guided by things that are outside of your control.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. On that, I have a couple of stories, and this again is not to say like, oh, look how great I am by any stretch, but it's more of a testament of when you do the work, what can happen. And I won't get into a long story, but I got mugged a couple of years ago, and I ended up talking the guy down. The guy ended up apologizing to me, and it was not a traumatic experience. Like I can talk about that experience and have zero emotional, energetic charge, right? Because of the story that I made about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a breakup that I had right after that, like forget about it. Like that was so traumatic
Right.
for me, right? Because of like the story that I made about it. So that
Mm-hmm.
makes such a big thing. But somebody has to have the skills, like the emotional tools to be able to do that. And this is a whole other podcast of why it was so hard that breakup was so hard for me, and the stories that I created about that. But we really do have the keys to whether or not we continue to create trauma in our lives or not. So
Right. Right. I love that.
yeah.
I think that kind of dovetails pretty well into how trauma creates the trapped emotions, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then how that can manifest in a variety of ways. But I'd love for you to touch on, like, seems a good place to dive into where the body code can help us access that beyond, these conscious tools that you have, and where you can think your way out of it by telling a different story, and where the subconscious is still going to kind of derail you even if you're trying to only think your way out of it.
Oh, yeah. So this is one of the things that I said that we'd be talking about was why like results coaching doesn't work for a lot of people. Yeah, I want to touch on that first before going into that question that you just said, is because oftentimes results coaching, and there's a paradigm shift happening, but a lot of times this like results coaching world is very masculine, and that masculine energy is just like go strive, don't you just move forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it basically is like, well, what's wrong with you? Right? And we'll just fix it, versus what happened to this person. What traumas did they experience? What kind of wounds do they have that need to be healed, right? So that they can move forward. There's, if we consistently deny the past and act like it didn't happen, I mean, we see this in society right now. Right? We look at this culturally, and I don't want to get into a big conversation, right, about race or, all of
Right.
these things, right? But I mean, it's so prevalent. Like, if we consistently act as if, right, shitty things didn't happen, right, it's just going to perpetuate from one generation to the next generation to the next generation and the next generation. And even though somebody may not have ever experienced, a specific trauma, that stuff gets stuck in the genes if it doesn't get released. And then, so then they're like, I don't know why I feel this way, but I do. And people can be like, well, it didn't happen to you. So why? Well, you're right. It didn't. And just like our DNA gets passed down, right? The energetic DNA gets passed down, and we can feel that energy in the body. And trauma gets stored inside the body, gets in the mind and in the body. And if we don't process an emotion, and so we're going to talk, like, if you have a stimulation, like something that happens where you feel like emotionally stimulated, and then your emotion goes up and up and up and up and up, and it reaches this climax, right? And then you don't have an outlet to, I hate this word, but to discharge that energy, right? Then it's going to get stuck in the body. And then those blocks disrupt our energy, and we'll consistently look for ways to feel that feeling again in hopes that that time is going to be the time that we can discharge it.
Right.
But that never happens, right? And we just keep going back to it and going back to it, not because we like it, but because it's familiar. Right?
Right.
And so that's what, like, when people who have experienced trauma, like, and you're seeing it play out in their lives, of whether they have addictions, whether they keep going into bad relationships, and it's like, why do you keep doing it? Just stop. Right? And that's what, like, results coaching, is like, well, just stop doing it.
Right.
Really,
Right.
fucktard? Like, like, if it were so easy, everybody would stop doing it. Right?
Right. We wouldn't have these problems. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an interesting analogy to me in, traditional medicine versus the non-traditional ways of healing, because it's, you can't just mask the symptoms. You've got to figure out why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, with the body code, what I personally love about it is that when I have somebody that I'm working with, and I tell them, like, from the get-go, like, just start writing down memories that you have, that when you think of them, like, you can feel your body, like, just start to
Yeah.
tense up, right? Or thoughts that you have that you're like, I cannot not think this thought. Like, I cannot let go of the thought, that I'm worthless, that I'm broken, right? All of these things that have these huge energetic charges, right? That's trauma stuck in the body. And what the body code does is we go in and we see, like, what the way that I do it anyway is I first ask, like, is this yours? Is this inherited, or is it absorbed? Because sometimes it's none of our stuff, but we're just playing it out. And then I ask, like, what the origin of it is. And sometimes, stuff comes back and it's like, oh, this went back 8 generations. People are like, well, that makes sense. Like, because I can look at my family history and see, not that most of us don't even know beyond, maybe we're lucky if we knew our great grandparents, but most people don't. But when you hear stories of the family, it's like, oh, that makes sense. Those stories of, like, oh, everybody in my family is broke, everybody in my family, right?
Right. Yeah. Those
Yeah.
are powerful. Yeah. Those are very powerful ones when you think it's hard to get past that if that's just how your family is, right? Or you believe that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So then we go in the body code and we ask, like, what's the imbalance that needs to be released? And we just go in and release it. And it could be a trapped emotion. It could be a despair anchor, which is a negative thought that we say over and over again that our body then seeks to fulfill. And again, it's not like we're intentionally being like, hey, I want to sabotage my life, right? But until we make the unconscious conscious, it's going to direct your life. right? And you're just going to be like, oh, this is just how it's supposed to be. No, no.
Right. Right.
And
We'll talk about victim mentality in a future episode, but
Mhm.
that's a fascinating one to me too.
Yeah. And that's what's so fascinating about doing this work, and specifically like for me combining it with the coaching stuff, is that you're like literally changing like somebody's energetic blueprint, which changes their whole entire destiny, right? And it seems like when I was struggling myself and I had to make dietary changes, that was my first shift for me, is like changing my diet, right? And it seemed like, oh, well, paying money to go to school, learn how to eat, like, oh, people would be like, but that's so expensive. Well, yeah, compared to the cost of dying, like, you know,
Right.
my $8,000 health coaching education, right, has exponentially earned me back so much more money. And look how many lives I've been able to impact because of that. Right? So investing in ourselves to release this stuff, like we have no idea how much it will shift the trajectory of, I can't talk, I can't say it.
Trajectory. Yeah, that's a hard one.
Right, right. Of not only our lives, but then our descendants' lives. Right. And even though for me, like I don't have kids, I may never have kids. Probably not. I'm 46. I don't think I want to have. No, I don't want to have kids. But I know like how many lives I've been able to impact, of other people's lives. So it may not be
Yeah.
that somebody that I birth, right? But we have to be able to understand that when somebody comes to us, whether you're a coach, whether you're a therapist, whether you're a human being, and you have another person you're interacting with another person, right? We have to understand that everyone has experienced trauma, and and that trauma impacts the way that they're dealing with you. It impacts the way that they respond. It impacts every single thing. And when somebody is disconnected from themselves, right, they're not going to be the most loving, person in the world.
Absolutely. And if they're not aware of it, certainly the people in their lives aren't aware of it.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of times they're just like, well, this is just who I am. I'm like, I'm not going to buy that. I don't think that you're just an asshole. Like, because I don't think that's how people are. I think that people at the core really are, just loving and kind, right? But they've just experienced a lot of pain and trauma. So then they're just acting out of that pain and trauma.
Right? I totally agree with you there. I think that I've always thought that everybody's good at heart, something made you. If you are a miserable person, something made you that way. But now we know there are ways that we can help that.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but like for me, I grew up in a conservative Christian home. So it was like, well, you're just sinful at heart. Like your heart is just sinful by nature. And I'm just like, and that's fine. Like we all have whatever it is that we want to believe about why somebody is acting in a not so great way. That's fine. Like, because at the end of the day, it still comes down to being disconnected with your soul.
Right. Yeah. I like
that. But I wanted to touch on trauma-informed care and just go into a little bit of what that is. And it's basically when all parties recognize and respond to the impact of trauma and promote environments of healing and recovery, rather than practices and services that may inadvertently re-traumatize. And so what that could look like is, okay, when I was in the results coaching world, I was still had a lot of trauma still that needed to be healed. And I remember like having some people coach me, and they would use the same tools that I was trained in. And they would just be like, well, you just need to change your state. And I'm like, no, that doesn't, if that would work, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. And then they just say, well, you're just uncoachable. Well, when somebody has been consistently told their whole life that they're wrong, and now they're in a coaching setting, and now their coach is telling them they're wrong because the two tools that the coach has to use isn't working for them, right? That's re-traumatizing.
Right.
Right. Another thing that is also like re-traumatizing is when I worked as a therapist, my first job as a therapist, I worked at a group home for adolescent girls. And what would happen is the social worker would bring the kid, and they'd have an interview with the therapist to see if the kid was a good fit for the home. Now you're talking kids who have been sexually abused, abandoned by their parents, like all the atrocities that you never want to think about, right?
Right.
They've never had agency in their whole life. And they come and they're being put into, been taken away from their families, and they come to this group home. And typically the interviews are basically the therapist to see like, okay, is she really going to be a pain in the ass, or like, can I handle it? And every girl that I had that would come in, I would say, listen, this is an interview that is just as much for you as it is for me. I want you to ask me questions, and I want you to decide whether or not you feel like we can work together. Because if you don't feel like we can work together, then I want to help you find the best place for you, because this won't be a good place for you if you don't feel like you can talk to me. And I understand, like, as a white woman, because most of my clients were African American or Latinas, I'm like, I understand that as a white woman, you might not want to talk to me. And so I want you to ask me questions. And Deb, every single kid that I interviewed, like the social worker would call and be like, she really wants to come there. Like she said she's never had anybody give her a choice.
Wow.
And so much of these trauma, like places that are helping people with trauma, just consistently take away their choice. Right. And really what is trauma, right? Is when we don't have a choice in something.
Yeah.
Right. Like collectively the world is going through this trauma, right? Because like it's like all of a sudden all of our choices have been taken away. And I don't want, again, the whole other conversation that we can go into, right? But all of a sudden it's like one day everything was fine, and then the next day you're like, oh wait, I can't go to the gym anymore. I can't even go on my Facebook without somebody telling me that I suck, or that I want to kill their grandmother because I might think differently than they do. Like, or, now I can't go to my job anymore. So many choices have been taken away. Right. So that in trauma informed care, and there's a couple of things that are important. 5 points are, first, that there's safety, that the person feels safe physically and emotionally. Right. And a lot of facilities and stuff, these like people will just get shoved into a room, right, and have nothing, no creature comforts or anything. And these are extreme cases, right? But even within, I've been in coach, I worked with a guy who's like all over the place about trauma informed care, and I did not have a safe experience at all. And I'm thinking, buddy, you teach on this stuff, and you just literally kept telling me how wrong I was.
Yeah.
So safety is, physically and emotionally, is a big part. Choice, like the individual having choice and control over their treatment. And granted, sometimes when people are in extreme trauma, like they're not the best ones to always make decisions, but taking the time to actually have those conversations, right? And to help them, along it, instead of just being like, this is what you're doing. Okay. And that's and that's the hard thing about this, is that most people don't want to take the time. Right. So we have safety, we have choice, we have collaboration. Is making decisions and sharing the power, letting somebody have agency in their healing, right? Not like, oh, this is just what you're going to do, but what are the things that you want to do that are going to help you to feel better too? Trustworthiness is also a big part. And just like that everybody's on the same page, and that they feel like, hey, this is a person that I can depend on, that they're not going to treat me, in any harm. And that there's clear boundaries, within that container of relationship. But then also empowerment, like giving that person, again, agency, like giving them tools that create the agency so that they can become their own independent person. Because most people who are traumatized, right, end up in like codependent relationships, right?
Yeah.
And are looking for people to constantly make decisions for them or do things, because they don't trust themselves, because they've been experienced so much trauma. So why would I trust myself? Right. and we want to give that agency, back to people. So that's trauma informed care.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are talking about it way more now, thankfully. And I think that it's so important, as a body code practitioner, that is even within the field, the realm of like the energy world, they're crappy people.
Yeah.
And there's crappy practitioners that are just like, well, this is what's wrong with you.
Yeah.
What?
Well, I mean, I think sometimes it's a field that it draws people that have their own healing that maybe hasn't been done yet, right? So,
Right.
you do have that. But it's interesting because you've mentioned a few times like how it is stories that we're telling ourselves, and sometimes people, they don't necessarily consciously know they're reluctant, but sometimes people don't want to let go of that story, right? Like they carry it for a reason. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, what have been your
Yeah.
experiences with your clients with that?
Yeah. And so that is, it's called a secondary gain. Right.
Mhm.
There's something that they get from that. And we can talk about this in another episode, but like you and I, when we worked together, we talked about, and Tony Robbins talks about this a lot, is the 6 human needs. And human psychology, there's 6 human needs. We have the need for certainty. Like we want to know that, like, we're going to eat tomorrow. Right.
Mhm.
But at the same time, if we had certainty every single day, it would be like the Truman Show, where you're like, okay, I know that this person's going to walk across this street. Blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Great movie if anybody hasn't seen it.
Right.
But so within that certainty, we also want to have uncertainty, because
Be boring.
tea all the time is just terrible.
Right.
Right. So I'm having some issues, computer issues. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
So we have certainty, uncertainty, and then we have love and connection, the desire for love and connection. Then we have the desire for significance. And most people get their significance from their insignificance. The people who are always
Interesting.
struggling, right?
Uh-huh.
It's like going back to like, oh, everybody in my family's always been broke. Everybody in my family is fat. I've always, been this. I've always been that. And that's where they get their significance from.
Yeah.
Instead of, wait, I can make changes and I can be who
Right.
I want to be. But they'd rather hold on to it because, one, it's familiar. And that's really the biggest one, right? It's familiar. Like, who am I
Yeah.
if I don't have this identity?
Right.
If I'm not a victim, like, who's going to love me? Who would I
Yeah.
be?
And interestingly, I can't remember now where I was talking to somebody about this, but also sometimes I think there's a little resistance to being the first person from your family to break out of that story.
Yes.
If it's a family history of always being broke or never going to college or always being unhealthy and overweight or whatever those things are, I've heard from people that when they are the first one to break out of it now, oh, your family's, what are you, better than us? What are like, who are you to make these changes?
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yep. And that's the person that does that is what they call a transition character, the transitional character. And, they are the ones that pave the way, but they're like, no more. Like, I don't want to experience this anymore. I want to break out of that pattern. And pretty much all of my clients are those people, because they're like, I want to, but I know that I have to do something different because all the other things like haven't been working.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but, and, I don't know. And I'm curious, I don't know if maybe something we can look up. Like, it's always fascinating to me of like, how is it that some people experience trauma? And we're talking like, so kids, like I said at the beginning, like you can have 2 kids in the same family. One like creates a story and uses it to empower them, and the other one creates a story and uses it to live a disempowered life. And anybody who's listening, if you know the answer to that, like, I would love to know, because
Right. I would too. It'd be an interesting study to see what other characteristics might link with that. But, I mean, there could be a million explanations for that for some people, whatever.
Mhm.
Ancestral karma might not always pass down the same way, or whatever, however you want to explain it.
Right.
But that does, I think we've talked a little bit about bringing the conscious forward. And so that awareness, once you know that there's something that you want to change, let's dive into like, where does the body code play into that, right?
Yes. Yeah. And it's like, what is that thing that's greater than you that says, like this isn't working for me anymore. I need to do
Right,
something different.
right.
And I'm willing to let go of who I was to become somebody different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But trauma is not a like we said at the beginning, like there's like just depths and depths and depths of this, that people, like you said, make careers out of.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hopefully we've given you some information to understand a bit more about what trauma is, and to understand like just the beginnings of how to care for somebody who's experienced trauma, which at the end of the day, first and foremost, comes down to you. Like whoever's watching this, like you've experienced trauma at some point in your life, whether it's a big T, little T. And in what ways can you like create for your world like a place of safety, a place where you feel like you have choices in your world and are not giving
Mm-hmm.
over your power to everybody else? What ways can you collaborate with yourself, right, to be able to take back your power? What ways can you trust yourself? Right, that's a big one. Most people don't trust themselves, and it's like, what are the things that you can do to start trusting yourself? Even if that's saying, you know what, every day I'm going to drink a glass of water, and
Yeah.
start building your trust from there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And in what ways can I create a world where I'm going to feel more empowered? Is it getting rid of certain friendships or getting more friendships? Is it turning off the TV, and turning on, a podcast or reading a book that's going to be beneficial? But what are the ways that you can like have trauma informed care for yourself? What ways
Mm-hmm.
can you love yourself? And instead of asking yourself, because the big question that comes up with everybody whenever something happens is they're like, oh, what's wrong with me?
Right.
Instead of asking like, oh, what's wrong with me, you say, okay, what wound needs to be healed and loved even more?
Right.
If we're not willing to do that work, everybody's going to piss us off all the time because we just see them as jerks, instead of like, oh, wait a minute, they're just somebody walking around with trauma the same way I am.
Right. Yeah. Right. And again, I think that probably my recurring theme is what can you take ownership of? Where can you take back that control over this story and how it's affecting you?
Right.
Because I mean, ultimately, all of these tools that we can provide, they're tools, but healing yourself is an inside job. Like, you've got to be the one that does it. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to participate in it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't participate, and there is something to be said, right? There's something to be said for, I know like a lot of people that I work on, like I start with the heart wall all the time, and they barely have the ability to want to make changes until we release that heart wall. And then they're like, oh, okay, now I can start doing this thing. Like they really need, that lifeline.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so even as a body code and emotion code practitioner, for us to see like, you know what, we have to meet them where they are. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And not write them off. And I'm not saying at all saying that you are, but like sometimes people get frustrated. They're like, they don't want to do anything. It's like, they don't have the capability to be able to do it. Right. But we have to give them the tools so that they can get there to that next level, so that they can take, agency, ownership in it.
Yeah. And patience. I think sometimes people are introduced to the concept, but until the timing is right for them, they're not going to hear it right. They're not going to embrace it. They're not going to, like there's something about that. I think that when you're really ready for it, it won't be as hard.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and we'd love to hear y'all's thoughts, comments, and Let us know if this was helpful for you or not. Also, just let us know whether it's sending a commenting on this or sending a message. Like, just let us know some things that you'd like to hear about. And even maybe Deb, maybe sometimes we can do some work on somebody like live on one of the calls.
That'd be awesome.
And
just
if
anybody wants us to, they should pipe up. And regarding the trauma, if there's insights or experiences to any of these questions that anybody wants to offer up, myself personally, I don't feel like I'm a super expert in this category, because I would say that the majority of the traumas in my life are mostly little T's, right? Like, I haven't, there's a few, but like, I haven't been through anything super tragic. So sometimes makes me feel like I might not be qualified to speak on the topic,
but it's not about speaking on the topic, right? It's about being able to provide that environment for safety, for healing to occur. And when I was in grad school for counseling, I remember when I was in the marriage and family unit, and we were talking, like in the marriage unit especially, people would ask, well, how am I supposed to work with married couples? I've never been married. And they're like, your job isn't, you're not a good therapist because you've been married. You're a good therapist because you're able to see patterns and help people to see those patterns and to shift them. And I was like, oh yeah. Right? I mean, some of the best coaches aren't because they're best, but they're great players, but they see what the players need to do. And so, like, my encouragement to you is like, yeah, you may not have experienced big traumas, and right, you have the heart and you have the capability to care for people and to help provide that space for people to heal.
Yeah.
So, like, just let's get rid of that.
Telling myself it's boring.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks everybody for tuning in. And again, let us know if you have any questions, any things that you'd like for us to work on. And even if you are like, oh, I'd like to have somebody work on me. Oh, and the one more thing, the great thing about the body code, I don't know why we didn't say this earlier, is that a lot of times when people have trauma, they'll go to therapy and they just keep telling the story over and over and over and over again. They keep experiencing it in their body. And coaching is like, forget about this. Let's just move on. And it's still stuck in the body. The thing about the body code, you don't have to keep telling that story over and over again. I tell my clients, bring me your list, and it's like, oh, the memory of when I was a 5, at the grocery store, or the memory of 9 when I was riding the car with my friend's mom, and that's all I need to know. I don't need to know the whole story. I've spent enough years as a therapist listening to stories. Like, I don't need to hear the whole story, and that's what's great about the body code, is we don't have to relive it over and over and over again for it to be released.
Yeah.
So
I do like that piece of it.
Yeah. I know, right? It's really fun. And it's so fun when I talk to people and I'm like, I'm like, oh, okay, on a scale of 0 to 10, what's the energetic charge? And they're like, it's a 10. I'm crying just talking about it. I'll do some work on it and then we'll get on the call and I'm like, hey, just want to check in. What's the charge? And they're like, I don't even remember saying that.
Right. So powerful. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We will see you next time. Have a great day, week, whatever you're listening to this.
However long it's been. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.